The west wind that scoured the single street of Dust Gulch tasted of grit and distance. It was a late afternoon in autumn, and the sun hung low and orange, turning the air thick with a fine powder the color of ash from a long dead fire. It settled on everything, a gray shroud over the raw timber of the false front buildings, the hitching rails, the watering trough where the water sat still and brown. It coated the shoulders of Colt Hale's duster, a fine layer that felt like a second morning. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Buck, dropped its head and blew a soft breath, stirring the dust at its feet. Colt ran a hand down the horse's neck, his movements slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he has learned that hurry buys nothing but an early grave. He had ridden into town for 3 things: flour and salt for himself, bullets for his Colt revolver, and coffee to make the lonely mornings bearable. Nothing more. He planned to be a ghost, a shape that passed through and left no echo. The town itself was little more than a scar on the land, a place for men to shed their trail dust and their pay in equal measure. There was a general store, a blacksmith's forge gone cold for the day, a livery, and the Red Lantern Saloon. From the saloon came the sound of life, or what passed for it in a place like this, the tinny complaint of a poorly tuned piano and the loud, braying laughter of men who had been drinking since noon. Colt tied Buck to the rail in front of the mercantile, giving the saloon a wide berth. Trouble lived in places like the Red Lantern. It festered in the cheap whiskey and the desperate hopes of the men who drank it. Colt had had his fill of trouble. It had taken his wife, Martha, in the form of a fever that burned through their small homestead like a prairie fire. It had taken his younger brother, Jacob, in the form of a rope and a crooked brand of justice dealt by a powerful rancher with a stolen herd and a lying witness. Colt carried the memories of both like stones in his gut. They were a constant reminder to walk softly, to keep his head down, and to mind his own business. He bought his supplies from a storekeeper with a weary face and eyes that had seen too many men like Colt come and go. The flour, salt, and coffee beans went into his saddlebags, the weight familiar and comforting. The box of cartridges for his peacemaker felt heavier. It was a tool, like a hammer or a spade, but it was a tool for making holes in things that bled. He hoped he would only ever need it for jackrabbits and the occasional coyote that grew too bold. As he stepped back out onto the warped boardwalk, the noise from the Red Lantern spilled over into a raw-throated argument. The batwing doors flew open and 2 men, both cattle hands by the look of their scuffed boots and sun-baked skin, stumbled out into the street. They were grappling, cursing, their faces flushed with liquor and rage. She was smiling at me. "You hear the bigger one," shouted, shoving the other man back. The smaller man tripped over his own feet and went down hard in the dust. A few men drifted out of the saloon to watch. Others stopped on the street. No one moved to intervene. This was common theater in Dust Gulch, a brief and brutal performance before the sun went down. Colt turned to untie his horse. This was not his fight. It was not his town. It was not his life. Then he saw her. She stood on the small porch of the saloon, framed by the dark doorway. She wore a dress the color of wine, or maybe blood, and it was the only vibrant thing in the dust-choked landscape. Her hair was a dark cascade pinned up loosely, and her face was a pale oval. She was beautiful, but it was a hard kind of beauty, one that had been looked at too much and seen too little. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her eyes were not on the men fighting, but on the indifferent faces of the crowd. The larger man, triumphant, drew back his foot to deliver a kick to the head of his fallen rival. It was a coward's blow, a finishing move meant to maim or kill. Colt did not think. He moved. 3 long strides and he was there. He did not shout a warning. He simply caught the man's booted foot in his hand, the leather thick and gritty against his palm. He stopped the kick inches from its target. The big man grunted in surprise and tried to pull his leg free. He spun around, his face a mask of drunken fury. "What in the hell you think you're doing, Mr.?" Colt released the man's foot and stood straight. He was not as broad as the cattleman, But he was taller, with a lean, hard stillness that spoke of a life spent in the saddle and under the open sky. The dust on his shoulders made him look like a figure carved from weathered stone. "He's had enough," Colt said. His voice was quiet, a low rasp that carried no more heat than the wind. The man's friends on the saloon porch began to hoot and jeer. "You gonna let him talk to you like that?" Hank, one of them, yelled. Hank puffed out his chest. The smell of whiskey and sweat rolled off him in a wave. "This ain't none of your concern. Step aside." Colt did not move. He just watched the man, his gray eyes flat and unreadable. He saw the shift of weight, the bunching of the shoulder muscles. The moment the man's clumsy mind decided on another punch, Colt beat him to it. It was not a barroom swing. It was a short, straight punch, thrown with the full weight of his body behind it, and it landed squarely on the man's jaw with a dry, cracking sound. Hank's eyes went vacant, his knees buckled, and he collapsed into the dust like a felled tree, silent and unmoving. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The man on the ground scrambled to his feet and scurried away without a backward glance. The onlookers on the porch stared, their jeers dead in their throats. Colt had not just ended a fight. He had ended it with an efficiency that was more unsettling than any amount of wild brawling. Colt looked at his knuckles. They were not even scraped. He felt the familiar, sour taste of regret in his mouth. He had broken his own rule. He had drawn attention. He had stepped into someone else's trouble. He raised his head, and his eyes met the woman's. She was still standing in the doorway, her posture unchanged, but her gaze was fixed on him now. There was no gratitude in her expression, no relief, no fear. There was only a cool, unnerving assessment. It was the look of a horse trader sizing up new stock, a prospector weighing a nugget in his hand. She was measuring him, calculating his worth, his strength, his potential for causing or solving problems. In that moment, he felt more exposed than he had when Hank was preparing to swing at him. A man stepped out of the saloon and put a possessive hand on her arm. He was handsome in a soft, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a silk vest. This was Vaughn Mercer, owner of the Red Lantern. Colt had heard the name. "Lila, get back inside," Mercer said, his voice a low command. He smiled at Colt, but the smile did not reach his cold eyes. "Thank you for the assistance. Friend, my boy here can get a little enthusiastic. No harm done." He made a gesture, and two of his men hauled the unconscious Hank off the street and back into the saloon as if he were a sack of grain. Mercer guided the woman, Lila, back through the doors before she disappeared. Her eyes met Colt's one last time. It was just a flicker, but it was enough. Colt turned and walked back to his horse. His hands felt steady as he untied the reins, but inside, a tremor was working its way through him. He had seen the sign tacked to the wall next to the saloon entrance. It was a gaudy, colorful poster advertising the talents of Lila Rousseau, the Louisiana songbird, promising music and beauty to soothe the savage heart. Underneath the flowery script, in small, dense print, were the terms of a performance contract, a legal document that bound her to this place, to Mercer. He had heard the whispers in the general store, too. Aldous Pike was on his way. Pike ran a traveling exhibition, a collection of oddities and wonders, both human and animal. The rumor was that Pike had taken an interest in Mercer's songbird and was coming to make an offer. He was a collector, and he did not like to be denied. Men like Mercer and Pike did not buy and sell singers. They bought and sold property. Colt swung into the saddle. The leather creaked under his weight. He looked down the dusty street at the Red Lantern Saloon. And he saw not just a building, but a cage. And he saw his brother Jacob, standing on a wooden platform with a rope around his neck, his eyes searching the crowd for a friendly face, finding only Colt's, helpless and frozen. He had been too young, too afraid to do anything then but watch. The memory was a brand on his soul. He nudged Buck with his heels and rode out of town. the gray dust rising behind him. He would make his camp by the dry creek bed a mile out. He would eat his meal, drink his coffee, and in the morning, he would ride west and not look back. Dust Gulch and its caged bird were not his concern. He had learned the hard way that trying to save someone often meant losing everything yourself. But as dusk settled over the high desert, painting the sky in shades of purple and bruised orange, a sound drifted on the cooling air. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing from the red lantern. It was not the loud, boisterous music of a saloon. It was a sad, soulful melody, a song of lost rivers and mossy trees, a sound of profound and heartbreaking longing. It was Lila's voice. The music wrapped around him, pulling at him, a current in the still air. It spoke of a different kind of cage, one made of memory and regret. He told himself to ignore it, to bank his fire and roll into his blankets. But the song was a hook, and it had caught something deep inside him. He stood up, the dust falling from his duster, with a curse that was half a prayer. He turned and started walking back toward the lights of the red lantern. He was just going to listen from the outside, he told himself. Just for a minute. But he knew, with a sinking certainty that settled back into the pit of his stomach, that he was lying. He had stepped in once, and the sad, beautiful music was pulling him in again, deeper into the heart of a trouble he knew he should have left alone. Colt did not go into the saloon. He stood across the street in the deep shadows of the livery stable, a place that smelled of hay and horse sweat and honest work. He listened. Her voice poured from the red lantern, a river of sorrow flowing through a land of stone. Each note was pure and clear, a testament to a soul that had not yet been broken. However bent it might be, he heard the forced applause when a song ended, the coarse demands for another. He stayed until the last mournful chord faded and the piano player struck up a jaunt, clumsy tune to send the drinkers stumbling into the night. He watched the last of the customers leave. Then he waited. A long time later, the back door of the saloon creaked open. Lila slipped out into the narrow alley, a pale shape in the moonlight. She leaned against the rough plank wall and wrapped her arms around herself. Though the night was not cold, Colt saw the slight tremor in her shoulders. He saw how she favored her left side, as if a recent, forceful shove had sent her careening into something hard. He moved from the shadows, his boots making almost no sound in the soft dust. She tensed at his approach, her head snapping up, her body coiling like a snake ready to strike. Fear and defiance warred in her eyes. He stopped a few feet away, leaving a space between them that she could close or keep open. He did not speak. Words would be clumsy things, easily mistaken. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, flat tin. It was a salve of pine resin and herbs his wife Martha had taught him to make, good for bruises and rope burns. He placed it on an overturned rain barrel near her hand. His gaze met hers for a second. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness without a sound. He did not look back to see if she took the tin. The offer was all he had to give. The choice had to be hers. The next morning, the sun rose over the eastern mesas, and the smell of coffee and bacon frying over his small fire did little to lift the weight from Colt's shoulders. He had packed his bedroll. His saddlebags were filled. There was nothing keeping him here, nothing but the memory of a song and the image of a woman's calculating eyes. He was a fool for staying, a ghost of a man chasing the ghost of a feeling. He was pouring a second cup of coffee when he heard the scuff of a shoe on the gravel of the dry creek bed. He looked up, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol holstered on his hip. It was Lila. She had a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the morning chill. In her hands, she carried a single tin cup, steam rising from it in a fragile ribbon. She stopped at the edge of his camp, just outside the circle of warmth from his fire. Her eyes, which had been so hard and guarded the day before, now held a deep and profound weariness. There was a faint discoloration on her cheekbone, a new shadow that had not been there last night. "I brought you coffee," she said. Her voice was lower than when she sang, a little rough around the edges. Colt gestured with his own cup toward a smooth, flat rock near the fire. "Sit." She hesitated, then moved to the rock and sat, placing the cup she carried on the ground between them. She did not drink from it. It was an offering. He understood. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Colt ate his bacon from the skillet. He was used to the silence. It was his most constant companion, but this silence was different. It was filled with unspoken questions. Finally, she spoke, her eyes on the flames. "You should have kept riding yesterday." "I know," he said. "It is not safe to make an enemy of Vaughn Mercer. I did not figure him for the sort who made friends." A small, bitter smile touched her lips for a fleet second and was gone. "You do not waste words, do you, Cowboy?" "They do not grow on trees out here," he replied, sipping his coffee. She looked up from the fire and met his gaze directly. The weariness was still there, but beneath it was a sharp, piercing intensity. It was the look of a person pushed to a final edge, with nothing left to lose by asking a dangerous question. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Colt set his cup down. He thought of the men in the saloon, their hungry, possessive stares. He thought of Mercer's hand on her arm. He thought of the talk of Aldous Pike in his collection. They all saw the same thing, a beautiful surface, a prize to be owned, a commodity to be fought over and traded. He looked at her, at the faint bruise on her cheek, the tension in her jaw, the fierce, caged intelligence in her dark eyes. He saw the beautiful singer. Yes, but he saw something else, something deeper that she kept hidden behind a wall of careful observation. He answered her quietly, his voice as plain and unadorned as the landscape around them. Men fought over her beauty, but the cowboy wanted the wild, forbidden truth she tried to hide. The words hung in the still morning air. He had not planned to say them. They had simply come, a simple truth rising to meet a simple question. He saw the change in her face. It was not dramatic. It was a subtle relaxing of the muscles around her eyes, a slight parting of her lips as if she had forgotten to breathe. He had not paid her a compliment. He had not offered pity or promised rescue. He had simply seen her, the real her, the one that was trapped behind the face and the voice that everyone else wanted. A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a quick, angry gesture, as if ashamed of the weakness. "The truth is not a pretty thing," she whispered. "I have not had much use for pretty things," Colt said. He picked up the empty skillet and began to scour it with sand from the creek bed. The simple, physical task was a relief. Later that morning, Colt rode back into Dust Gulch. He left Buck at the livery and walked to the blacksmith's forge. The ring of a hammer on steel was a clean, honest sound. Eli Navarro, the blacksmith, was a barrel-chested man with kind eyes and arms roped with a muscle. He nodded at Colt as he entered the smoky workshop. "Heard you cooled off Hank Miller yesterday," Eli said, not missing a beat with his hammer. "He was overheated," Colt replied, leaning against a workbench. "Mercer does not like people touching his things." Eli plunged a glowing piece of iron into a barrel of water. It hissed and steamed, and the forge filled with a sharp, metallic smell. "And Hank is one of his—" "I noticed." Colt looked around the workshop and saw it in the corner, a heavy freight wagon. Its rear axle split clean through. The words, "Red Lantern Saloon," were painted on its side in faded red letters. "Looks like Mercer has got trouble of his own," Colt said. Eli wiped his brow with a forearm, leaving a streak of soot. "That axle snapped 2 days ago. Mercer wants it fixed by the end of the week. Says he is expecting a visitor. Important guest." "Aldous Pike," Colt said. It was not a question. Eli's hammer paused. He looked at Colt, his expression serious. You have heard the talk. Pike is not a man to disappoint. He travels with a long purse and short patience. Word is, everything has a price with him. He glanced meaningfully toward the saloon down the street, and everyone. You need a hand with that axle, Colt asked. Changing the subject. Looks like a two-man job to get it set right. Eli studied him for a moment. I could use one, but helping me with Mercer's wagon, it might look like you are choosing a side. I am just a man looking for a day's work, Colt said. Sides are for people who plan on staying. He spent the rest of the day in the heat and smoke of the forge, working with Eli. The work was hard and clean. It felt good to build something, to mend something broken. He and Eli worked mostly in silence, a comfortable understanding passing between them. Late in the afternoon, as they were wrestling the new, heavy axle into place, he saw her. Lila was walking down the opposite boardwalk, carrying a basket. One of Mercer's men walked a few paces behind her, a casual guard. She stopped, pretending to look at a display in the mercantile window. But her gaze was on him, across the street. She watched him for a long time. She saw his hands, steady and sure, working with the heavy tools. She saw the patience in his posture as he and Eli measured and fitted the wood and iron. She saw a man who fixed what was broken, who did not use his strength to smash and take, but to create and repair. Her expression was unreadable from that distance, but she stood there until the guard grew impatient and urged her along. As she walked away, Colt felt a familiar dread settle over him. He was becoming entangled. Every quiet conversation, every shared glance, every swing of the hammer on Mercer's broken wagon was a thread binding him to this place, to her fate. He was afraid, not of Mercer or Pike, but of himself. He was afraid of the hope that was beginning to flicker in the dark, cold place where his brother's memory lived. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made a man reckless. It made him believe he could change things that were set in stone. And the last time he had hoped, he had ended up burying his own kin. Aldous Pike arrived not on a horse, but in a black lacquered carriage that seemed to suck the light out of the afternoon. It was drawn by two perfectly matched gray horses, and a driver in a severe black coat handled the reins. The carriage was an alien thing in the dust and raw timber of the town, a piece of a colder, more sophisticated world. Pike himself emerged like a spider from a dark hole. He was a tall, slender man dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray. He moved with an unnerving economy of motion, his pale eyes taking in everything without seeming to focus on anything. He did not look at the red lantern. He looked at the town as if it were a map of his own intentions. The air in the saloon that night was thick and sour with anticipation. It was not the usual rowdy crowd. Men spoke in lower voices. Their laughter was brittle. They were not here just for drinks and a song. They were here to witness a transaction. Vaughn Mercer moved through the room with a tight, predatory smile, his silk vest gleaming in the lantern light. He was a showman presenting his prize jewel, and in the corner, at a private table, sat Aldous Pike, a glass of untouched whiskey in front of him, his posture as still and patient as a waiting vulture. Colt stood near the back, by the door, his hat pulled low. He had told himself he was only here to watch, to see for himself what would happen. But the weight of the Colt on his hip felt heavier tonight, a cold and solid reminder of the promise he had not yet made. When Lila stepped onto the small wooden stage, a hush fell over the room. She wore a deep blue dress that made her skin look like porcelain. She held a guitar, its dark wood polished to a soft gleam. She looked out over the sea of faces, her own face a pale, beautiful mask. Her eyes found Pike in his corner, and for a half-second, a flicker of something raw and terrified broke through the composure. Then it was gone. She looked down at her instrument, took a breath, and began to play. The first notes were clear and haunting, the beginning of a sad ballad from her Louisiana home. Her voice joined the music, just as pure, just as heartbreaking as it had been the night before. The men in the room leaned forward, captivated. Mercer smiled his satisfied, owner's smile. Then it happened. Her fingers slipped on the fretboard, producing a sour, jarring note that cut through the melody. A few men chuckled. Mercer's smile tightened. Lila faltered, her voice wavering on a single word. She tried to recover, her fingers moving again, but they seemed clumsy, disobedient. She struck another wrong chord, a discordant clang that made the listeners flinch. Her voice, when she tried to sing again, was no longer a clear river. It was a choked, trembling thing. It cracked, broke, and then fell silent. The only sound in the room was the ugly hum of the last wrong note from her guitar. She stared at the instrument in her hands as if it were a snake that had just bitten her. Her face was chalk white. A sheen of sweat beaded on her upper lip. "Sing, girl," Mercer commanded from the side of the stage, his voice a low, menacing hiss. Lila looked up, her eyes wide with a desperate, trapped panic. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hand went to her throat. She took a ragged, shuddering breath, then another. A violent tremor ran through her body. She turned away from the crowd, dropped the guitar, and retched, a terrible, guttural sound of a body in full revolt. The room erupted. Some men laughed cruelly. Others murmured in disgust. Mercer was on the stage in an instant. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You stupid little fool," he snarled, his voice low enough for only her to hear, but his fury was a palpable thing. He raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound of the blow was sharp and ugly, a crack that silenced the room. Lila staggered back, a red mark blooming on her pale cheek. She did not cry out. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a sudden, terrible emptiness. From his corner, Aldous Pike rose slowly to his feet. He walked toward the stage, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He did not look at Mercer. His cold, appraising gaze was fixed entirely on Lila. He stepped onto the stage and walked toward her as a rancher might approach a spooked, damaged mare. "A spirited performance," Pike said, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. He reached out and tilted her chin up with a single, long finger, turning her face this way and that, examining the red mark as if it were a flaw in a piece of merchandise. "But perhaps she is a bit too fragile for this climate." That was the moment Colt moved. He did not remember making the decision. 1 second he was a shadow by the door. The next, he was a force of controlled violence pushing through the stunned crowd. He vaulted onto the stage, shoving a startled Mercer aside. He placed himself between Pike and Lila, shielding her with his body. "Let her go," Colt said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the saloon like a razor. Pike let his hand drop from Lila's chin. He looked at Colt, a flicker of mild surprise in his pale eyes. "And who might you be?" Colt did not answer. He was looking at Lila, at the tear that now traced a slow path down her bruised cheek. Without taking his eyes off her, he reached back and took her hand. It was ice cold. "I believe this is a private conversation," Pike said, his tone hardening almost imperceptibly. "It is over," Colt said. He drew his Colt peacemaker. The movement was a fluid, economical blur. The heavy barrel came up to point not at Pike's chest, but at the floorboards just in front of his polished boots. The message was clear. It was a line drawn in the dirt. "Step aside," Colt said to Pike. His voice was flat, final. For a long moment, no one moved. Mercer stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Pike looked from the gun to Colt's face, his expression one of cold calculation. He was weighing the value of this particular acquisition against the cost of a messy, public confrontation. Finally, Pike gave a small, dry smile. "As you wish." He took a deliberate step backward, off the stage. Colt did not wait for more. He pulled gently on Lila's hand. "Come on." He led her off the other side of the stage, past the out-of-tune piano. toward a back room. He could feel the eyes of every man in the saloon on his back. He heard Mercer start to shout his name, a string of curses following. He ignored it. He pushed open the door to a storeroom that smelled of stale beer and sawdust. Another door at the far end led to the alley. He pushed her through it, into the cool night air. "This way," he said, his voice urgent. He did not lead her toward the main street, but deeper into the narrow space between the buildings. Then into a maze of smaller alleys that wound behind the town. They did not run in a blind panic. He moved with purpose, his hand firm on her arm, guiding her through the darkness. He had spent the last 2 days walking this town, learning its ways, its exits. He had known this moment might come. He led her past the livery, into the scrubland that bordered the town. The sounds of the saloon faded behind them, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the sigh of the wind. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the sand and stones. They climbed a short, steep rise and slipped into a narrow crevice between two large rock formations. It was here, in this natural shelter, hidden from view of the town, that he had made his camp. His bedroll and saddlebags lay near the ashes of his morning fire. He let go of her arm. She stumbled to a halt, leaning against the cold stone of the canyon wall, her breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. She was shaking uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from the shock of the past hour. Colt did not try to comfort her with words. He knew she was beyond their reach. He knelt and began to build a small fire, his movements quick and efficient. He needed to get her warm. The desert night could steal a person's heat in minutes. "We have little water," he said, his voice low and calm as he struck a match. The flame flared, catching the tinder, and no compass. "We will have to travel by the stars tonight." She did not respond. She was staring into the growing flames, her eyes wide and unfocused. He stood up and took his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Drink, not too much." Her hand trembled as she took it. She drank, the water spilling down her chin. "We need to stay close to the rock walls," he continued, his tone steady, practical. He was giving her something to focus on besides her own terror. "They hold the sun's heat for a few hours after dark. It will keep us from freezing." He took his bedroll and shook it out, laying the thick wool blanket on the sandy ground. "Sit," he said. He took off his own dusty duster and draped it over her trembling shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of horse and wood smoke. She sank to the ground, pulling the coat and the blanket around her. They sat in silence, watching the small fire push back the immense darkness of the desert. He knew they were not safe. Pike and Mercer were not men who would let this go. They would send men, they would hunt them. He looked over at Lila. She had stopped shaking, but she was still staring into the fire with that same empty, shattered look. He needed to keep her moving, to keep her mind working. "In the morning," he said quietly, "we listen. You hear the finches, the little brown birds. They never build their nests more than 100 yards from a stream or a seep. They will show us where to find water." She turned her head slowly and looked at him. In the flickering firelight, he saw the question in her eyes. It was the same question she had asked that morning. Why? He had no answer for her. He had no answer for himself. He only knew that he had seen her truth, the wild and forbidden thing she tried to hide, and he could not, would not, let it be snuffed out in the darkness of Dust Gulch. He had made his choice. Now they would both have to live with it, or die trying. They moved through the last hours of darkness in a shuffling, exhausted rhythm. Colt led, picking a path through the treacherous landscape of arroyos and rockfalls with an instinct born of a lifetime spent under the stars. Lila followed, her fine blue dress torn and snagged, the thin soles of her shoes no match for the sharp stones. The cold of the high desert had seeped into her bones, a deep and shivering ache that the weight of Colt's duster could not entirely banish. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a profound, disorienting sense of unreality. The world she had known, a world of 4 walls, a stage, and the stale smell of whiskey, had been shattered. Dawn came not as a gentle awakening, but as a slow, cruel unveiling. The rising sun cast long, razor-edged shadows and illuminated the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the land around them. And it illuminated their tracks, a clear and desperate trail leading back toward Dust Gulch. Colt stopped, scanning the series of ridges behind them. His body was tense, his face a grim mask of concentration. "He will not send a posse," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Not Pike. He is a tidy man. He will send one hunter, someone quiet, someone good." He did not have to say anything more. The threat was a silent presence, a feeling of being watched that prickled the skin on the back of Lila's neck. They pressed on, moving deeper into a labyrinth of red rock canyons where the walls rose up like ancient, silent giants. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them, and the little water they had was nearly gone. Thirst became a dry, rasping thing in Lila's throat. It was mid-afternoon when the first shot came. It was not the loud boom of a pistol, but the sharp, flat crack of a rifle from a great distance. A puff of dust exploded from a rock a few feet to Lila's left, and the whine of the ricochet echoed off the canyon walls. Down, Colt's voice was a whip crack. He grabbed her, pulling her behind a massive boulder that offered some cover. He peered around the edge, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon high above them. "He has the high ground. He has us pinned." Another shot kicked up a spray of gravel. Closer this time. Colt drew his peacemaker, but it was a useless gesture. The hunter was too far away. A hidden spider on a high, sunlit web? They were trapped. "I am going to draw his fire," Colt said, his voice low and urgent. "When he shoots, you run. Follow this wash around the bend. There is a rock slide on the other side. Find cover in it. Do not stop. Do not look back. You understand?" Lila stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And you?" "I will keep him busy," he said. His eyes met hers, and in their gray depths, she saw not fear, but a grim, unyielding resolve. "Go." He took a breath, then broke from cover, running in a low crouch toward another cluster of rocks 50 yards away. The rifle cracked again from above. Colt grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and stumbled, his left side lurching as if he had been punched. He did not fall. He kept moving, diving behind the rocks. Lila was frozen for a half-second, her mind screaming. Then his command broke through the panic. "Run!" She ran, her breath tearing at her lungs, her legs pumping, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in her ears. She did not dare look up at the canyon rim. She rounded the bend in the dry wash, her eyes searching desperately for the rock slide. She could hear nothing behind her but the pounding of her own blood. Then she heard the rifle shot, closer this time, and a cry of pain that was not Colt's. She skidded to a stop, her back pressing against the canyon wall. She risked a glance back around the bend. What she saw would be burned into her memory forever. A man was working his way down a steep, shale-covered slope from the canyon rim. He was wiry and moved with a predatory grace, a rifle held in one hand. This had to be the hunter, Asa Grigg. And below, near the rocks where Colt had taken cover, Colt was on one knee, his pistol on the ground beside him. He was clutching his side, and a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. He was trying to push himself up, to reach his weapon, but his movements were slow, agonizing. Asa Grigg saw it, too. He stopped his descent, raised his rifle, and took his time, settling the stock against his shoulder, taking a careful aim at the wounded, helpless man below. Time seemed to slow down. Lila saw it all with a terrible, crystalline clarity: Colt's pale, sweat-sheened face, the dark mouth of the rifle barrel, the cold indifference in the hunter's eyes. This was the end. This was how it ended, in blood and dust, under a merciless sun. And in that moment, something inside her broke. It was the part of her that had learned to be still, to endure, to be a pretty thing in a cage. A wild, ferocious instinct she never knew she possessed rose up to take its place. It was not a thought. It was a physical imperative, a command that screamed through her veins. Live. She turned and ran back the way she had come. Asa Grigg was focused on his target, deaf to the sound of her scuffling shoes on the gravel. She reached the spot where Colt lay. His eyes widened in disbelief and warning as he saw her. He tried to speak, to tell her to run, but only a pained whisper came out. She did not look at him. Her eyes were on the heavy, black Colt peacemaker lying in the dust beside his hand. Her fingers, which knew the delicate touch of guitar strings, closed around the checkered grip of the gun. It was shockingly heavy, a solid, cold weight of unforgiving metal. She rose to her feet, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it. She raised the gun, using both hands to steady the long barrel, just as she had seen men do. She pointed it up the slope at the dark shape of Asa Grigg. He was a blur through the haze of her terror. He had not fired yet. He was savoring the moment. She pulled the trigger. The gun exploded in her hands, a deafening roar that slammed her shoulder back. The shot went wide, striking the rock face high above the hunter's head. He flinched, startled, his aim broken. He looked down, his face a mask of surprise and then annoyance. He was turning the rifle toward her now. Lila did not think. She did not aim. She simply squeezed the trigger again and again and again, the gun bucking in her grip, the thunderous reports echoing through the canyon. She fired until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. One of her wild, desperate shots found its mark. Asa Grigg gave a choked cry, a sound of profound surprise. The rifle clattered from his hands. He took a clumsy step backward, lost his footing on the loose shale, and tumbled, rolling down the slope to land in a still, broken heap at the bottom. Silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the canyon, broken only by Lila's own harsh, sobbing breaths. She stared at the gun in her hand, then let it drop as if it were a hot coal. She looked at the still form of the hunter, and a wave of nausea washed over her. Then she remembered Colt. She scrambled to his side. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. "You came back," he whispered, his voice laced with pain and disbelief. "I could not," she began, but the words would not come. She helped him to his feet, taking his weight on her small frame. He leaned on her heavily, his arm draped over her shoulders, and together they stumbled away from the place of blood and gunfire, deeper into the silent canyons. They found the adobe hut just as the sun was setting. It was a ruin, half collapsed, the roof mostly gone, but the mud brick walls were thick and solid, and inside, in a corner where the rock face met the wall, a tiny, miraculous trickle of water seeped from the stone, forming a small, clear puddle on the floor. It was a sanctuary. She eased him to the ground, his back against the wall. His shirt was soaked with blood. With trembling fingers, she tore a long strip from the hem of her dress and gently pulled his shirt aside. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow along his ribs, a deep and angry-looking wound that was still oozing blood. She cleaned it as best she could with the precious water and her makeshift bandage. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever. As darkness fell, she huddled beside him, listening to his ragged breathing, a terror colder than the desert night clutching at her heart. He began to talk in his delirium, his voice a low, broken murmur. He spoke a name, over and over. "Martha, Martha, I am sorry." The name was a blade that slid into Lila's heart. So this was the ghost that haunted him. This was the source of the deep sadness in his eyes. He had loved, and he had lost. He thrashed, his hand reaching out, and his fingers closed around her wrist. His eyes were open, but saw nothing. He was looking into his own past, at a pain she could only guess at. His voice grew clearer, stronger, filled with a raw and desperate conviction. "I will trade my peace for your freedom," he whispered, his grip tightening on her wrist. The words were a vow, a prayer spoken into the fevered darkness. "I will." He slipped back into unconsciousness, but the words remained, hanging in the still, cold air of the ruined hut. Lila sat beside him, his words echoing in her soul. He had not rescued her for glory, or possession, or pity. He had done it because he saw a truth in her, and he was willing to trade his own hard-won, solitary peace for the chance of her liberty. For 3 days, she was his keeper. She brought him water, drop by drop. She bathed his face and kept the fire small but constant. She did not sleep. On the 4th morning, his fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time. He was weak, his face hollowed out by the ordeal, but he was alive. He watched her for a long time, a new understanding in his gaze. He knew what she had done. He knew she had saved his life. A few days later, when some of his strength had returned, he took a small piece of dried cottonwood and his pocket knife. He sat for hours, his hands slow but steady, the knife blade whispering against the wood. He was carving. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small bird, no bigger than her thumb. It was simple, but beautifully rendered. The lines were clean, the shape perfect, but it was the wings that held her gaze. They were not fully spread for flight, nor were they tucked tightly against its body in repose. They were half spread, half tucked, caught in a moment of hesitation, or perhaps a moment of decision, poised between the safety of the nest and the vast, unknown freedom of the sky. She took it from him, the smooth, pale wood warm in her palm. It felt like holding her own heart in her hand. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet mending, a fragile peace forged in the heart of an immense and hostile wilderness. Their sanctuary, the ruined adobe hut, became a home. The slow trickle of water from the rock was the heartbeat of their small world. Colt's wound healed slowly, a deep, persistent ache that reminded him of his own mortality. He moved with a stiff, careful grace, his strength returning in small, daily increments. Lila, in turn, began to heal from wounds that were not visible. The haunted, terrified look in her eyes was gradually replaced by a watchful calm. She found a small, sheltered patch of earth near the seep where the soil was dark and damp. Using a sharpened stick in her bare hands, she cleared the stones and planted the few wild onion bulbs and edible roots she managed to forage. It was a pitifully small garden, a tiny act of faith against the vast indifference of the desert, but she tended it with a fierce devotion. She was not just coaxing life from the dry ground, she was planting a piece of herself, a declaration that she was more than just a survivor. She was a creator. Colt watched her, his silence a form of respect. He spent his days exploring their immediate territory, learning its rhythms, its secrets. He found a small box canyon where a handful of wild mustangs had taken shelter. Among them was a young mare, her coat the color of honey, her eyes full of a wild, intelligent fire. He did not try to capture her with a rope. Instead, every day, he would walk to the canyon and simply stand, letting her grow accustomed to his scent, his stillness. He would speak to her in a low, quiet voice. It was a slow and patient courtship, a taming built on trust, not on force. He was teaching the mare that he was not a threat, and in doing so, he was teaching himself the same lesson. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened, a sharp, biting cold that the small fire could not fully defeat. The adobe walls offered shelter from the wind, but the chill was relentless. One night, shivering uncontrollably under her thin blanket, Lila felt Colt shift behind her. He did not speak. He simply moved closer until their backs were pressed together, a solid line of warmth from shoulder to hip. There was nothing of passion in the touch, only a shared and simple need. It was the honest, unthinking warmth of two creatures huddled together against the dark. From then on, they slept that way, back to back, a silent pact against the cold, their shared breath misting in the air. In that simple, profound closeness, a trust deeper than words began to grow. But the world beyond their canyon did not forget them. As Colt's strength returned, he knew they needed supplies. Their small store of scavenged food was dwindling. One morning before dawn, he took his pistol and a small sack and began the long, careful journey to a remote trading post he knew of, a lonely outpost miles from any town. He traveled through the rocklands, avoiding the main trails, a ghost moving through a silent world. The trading post was little more than a sod house built into the side of a hill, run by an old man with a face like a dried apple. Colt traded a few silver coins for flour, salt, and cartridges. As the old man was wrapping his goods, Colt saw it, nailed to the rough plank wall beside the door. It was a poster, freshly printed. His blood ran cold. But the name on the poster was not his in big, bold letters. It read, "Reward." Beneath the heading was a crude but recognizable sketch of Lila. The text was not the usual language of a wanted poster for an outlaw. It spoke of a runaway performer, a violation of a binding labor contract held by Mr. Vaughn Mercer of Dust Gulch. It offered a staggering sum for information leading to the recovery of his property. The amount was 3 times what any small-town saloon owner could afford. This was not Mercer's money. This was Pike's. The poster was not a call for justice. It was a bill of sale, an advertisement that had been plastered across the entire territory. Lila was not a fugitive. She was a prize, a valuable piece of merchandise with a price on her head. Colt rode back to their sanctuary with a heavy heart, the news a cold stone in his gut. The peace they had built was an illusion, a brief pause in a storm that was now gathering force all around them. He did not tell her about the poster. He could not bring himself to put that hunted look back in her eyes. The storm broke 3 days later. It came not as wind and rain, but in the form of 3 men on horseback. They were not professionals like Asa Grigg. They were prospectors. By the look of their ragged clothes and the gold pans tied to their saddles, their faces were hard and greedy, their eyes alight with the fever of a lucky strike. They had been following the small stream from their own camp and had stumbled upon the impossible, a green patch of life in the middle of nowhere. Colt was checking on the wild mare when he heard Lila's sharp, terrified cry. He ran, his healing side screaming in protest, his hand already on the grip of his pistol. He emerged from the narrow canyon entrance to see a scene of brutal violation. The 3 men had dismounted. One was stomping through Lila's small garden, his heavy boots crushing the tender shoots. Another was holding Lila by the arm, his dirty hand tangled in her hair, a leering grin on his face. The third was watching, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "Look what we got here, boys," the man holding Lila crowed. "Looks like we found Mercer's runaway songbird. That reward is as good as ours." Time seemed to bend and stretch. Colt saw the terror in Lila's eyes, the brutal triumph on the man's face, the trampled green of the garden. A cold, quiet rage settled over him, pushing aside all pain, all fear. He stepped out from behind the rocks. "Let her go," he said, his voice deadly calm. The men spun around, surprised. The one holding Lila tightened his grip, pulling her in front of him like a shield. The man with the rifle started to bring the weapon up. Colt was faster. His peacemaker was in his hand, roaring once. The man with the rifle staggered back, a look of profound shock on his face, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He collapsed without a sound. The man holding Lila shoved her to the ground and drew his own pistol. Colt fired again. The second man grunted, clutching his stomach as he fell to his knees, his shot going wild into the sky. The third man, the one who had trampled the garden, stared at his fallen companions, his face a mask of disbelief and raw panic. He did not reach for his gun. He scrambled back to his horse, clawing his way into the saddle. He spurred the animal mercilessly, galloping away in a blind terror. Never once looking back, a witness had escaped. Their sanctuary was no longer a secret. Colt stood over the 2 still bodies, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. The silence that fell was more terrible than the noise of the gunshots. He looked at Lila, who was pushing herself up from the ground, her face pale, her eyes wide. He looked at the trampled garden, its small life crushed into the dirt. Their fragile peace was gone, murdered as surely as the men who lay dead at his feet. He went to her, holstering his pistol. He helped her up, his hands gentle on her arms. She was shaking, but not with the helpless terror of the night they fled the saloon. This was a tremor of cold, hard fury. She pulled away from him and walked to what was left of her garden. She knelt and touched a broken stem with her fingertips. She stayed there for a long time, her back to him. When she finally rose and turned to face him, the woman who had been a victim was gone. In her place was someone he had never seen before, someone with eyes of polished steel. "He will tell them where we are." She said it was not a question. "Yes," Colt answered. "Then more will come." "Yes." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "We cannot run forever. I cannot live my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next man with a poster in his hand." She took a deep breath, her decision settling into her like stone. "As long as that piece of paper, that contract, still exists, I am not a person. I am still his merchandise." Her voice was quiet, but it held the unshakable force of a river changing its course. "I am going back to Dust Gulch." Colt stared at her, the words a physical blow. "Lila, no, it is a trap. Pike will be waiting." "Then let him wait," she said, a fire kindling in her eyes. "I am through with being hunted. I will not be a bird in a cage, and I will not be a rabbit in a snare. I'm going back to burn that piece of paper. I am going back to burn my old life to the ground." They traveled back toward Dust Gulch like shadows, moving only under the cloak of a moonless sky. The journey was a grim reversal of their desperate flight. Every rock, every twisted juniper seemed to hold a memory of their terror. But this time, they were not running from something. They were moving toward it. Fear was still a cold companion, but it was overshadowed by Lila's cold, unyielding resolve, a force that seemed to pull Colt along in its wake. They made their final camp in the familiar rocks overlooking the town, the same place where Colt had first listened to her sing. Dust Gulch was a handful of pale lights in a vast, dark emptiness. It looked small, fragile, but they both knew the poison it held. "We cannot go in shooting," Colt said, his voice a low whisper against the wind. "The whole town will be on us. Pike will have men everywhere." "I know," Lila replied, her gaze fixed on the distant glow of the red lantern. "I do not want to fight the whole town. I just want one piece of paper. It will be in Mercer's room, in a safe, most likely." "No," she said, a new certainty in her voice. "Mercer is a coward. He does not trust banks, and he does not trust safes he cannot carry. He trusts the floorboards under his bed. There is a small wooden box, inlaid with mother of pearl. He keeps all his contracts in it." Colt looked at her, surprised by the detail. "How do you know that?" "A woman who cleans is invisible," she said, a bitter edge to her words. "She sees everything." She turned to him. "But I cannot get to his room. He keeps it locked, and he keeps me in sight." They needed someone on the inside. Colt thought of the people he had met. Eli the blacksmith was a good man, but this was not a task for a hammer. Then he remembered a face, a woman who worked in the saloon, cleaning tables and serving drinks. She had a weary, worn-down look, but he had seen the flash of empathy in her eyes the night Lila had broken down on the stage. Her name was Millie Hart. The plan they made was simple, which meant it had 100 ways to go wrong. Lila would slip into town and find Millie, ask for her help. If Millie agreed, she would get the box while Mercer was busy downstairs managing the saloon. Colt and Lila would wait in the darkness of the livery stable across the street. Once Millie had the box, she would signal them, and they would be gone. Lila moved through the back alleys of Dust Gulch like a wraith, her shawl pulled over her head. She found Millie behind the saloon, shaking out a dusty rug. The older woman started at her appearance, her eyes wide with fear. "They will kill you if they find you here," Millie whispered, her voice trembling. "They will kill me if I keep running," Lila answered, her own voice low and steady. She did not plead. She did not beg. She simply explained what she needed, her eyes holding Millie's, a shared understanding passing between them of a life lived under the thumb of men like Vaughn Mercer. Millie hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. She looked at the saloon, then back at Lila's desperate, determined face. A spark of long-suppressed defiance kindled in her tired eyes. "Under the third floorboard from the window," she said, her voice barely audible. "Be at the livery in an hour." The livery stable smelled of hay, dust, and the warm, living scent of horses. Colt and Lila found a deep stall in the back, the darkness a thick, comforting blanket. The sounds from the red lantern across the street were a muted roar, a constant reminder of the danger that lay just a few dozen yards away. They waited. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The soft nicker of a horse, the scuttling of a mouse in the hay. Every sound made their nerves jump. A shadow fell across the wide doorway of the stable. It was not Millie. An impressive performance. A smooth voice said from the darkness, "Both of you. Such passion, such loyalty. It is quite touching." Aldous Pike stepped into the faint light filtering from the saloon, a silhouette of tailored elegance. Two men flanked him, both holding shotguns, their barrels looking like dark, hungry mouths. "I confess I am disappointed," Pike continued, his voice calm, conversational. "I expected a more sophisticated plan, but I suppose desperation does not breed creativity." He took a step forward. "Now, Miss Rousseau, if you will be so kind as to come with me, we have a contract to discuss." Before Colt could react, before he could even draw his weapon, there was a sharp crack. The single lantern hanging from a beam in the center of the stable exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. The world plunged into an absolute, disorienting blackness. One of Pike's men had fired. In the chaos, Colt acted on pure instinct. He shoved Lila hard toward the back of the stall. "The saloon," he yelled, his voice a raw command. "Get into the crowd! Go!" He drew his peacemaker and fired into the darkness. Not at a target, but at the spot where he had last seen Pike's men. The muzzle flash was a blinding white flower that bloomed and died in an instant, illuminating a scene of frantic motion. He fired again, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A man cried out in pain. The horses were screaming now, kicking against their stalls. Another shotgun blast ripped through the darkness, splintering the wooden wall just above Colt's head. He could hear Lila scrambling out of the back of the stall, heading for the street. He fired one last time to cover her movement, then turned and followed, a ghost in the swirling dust and smoke. He burst out of the livery stable and saw her, a fleeting shape running across the street, pushing through the bat-wing doors of the red lantern. He ran after her, his boots pounding on the hard-packed dirt. He hit the doors a second behind her and plunged into the saloon. The scene inside was chaos. Men were shouting, overturning tables, trying to understand the source of the gunfire. The piano player had stopped mid-tune, his hands frozen above the keys. Lila was trying to lose herself in the panicked crowd, but Pike was already there, stepping through the doors behind Colt, his face a mask of cold fury. His two gunmen, one of them clutching a bleeding arm, were right behind him. The patrons of the Red Lantern, seeing the guns, scrambled to get away, creating a wide, empty space in the center of the room. Suddenly, Lila was alone, exposed, with nowhere left to run. Pike raised his pistol, a small, elegant derringer that looked like a toy but was just as deadly as any other. He pointed it directly at Lila. "You have cost me a great deal of time and money, my dear," he said, his voice slicing through the noise. Colt saw it all in a frozen moment, Pike's cold eyes, the small, dark hole of the derringer's barrel, the terrified look on Lila's face. He did not think. He did not plan. He launched himself forward, a desperate, lunging movement, covering the space between them in two long strides. He put himself directly in front of Lila, his body a shield, just as Pike pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was small, almost insignificant in the large room. But the impact was a mule kick to his chest, a white, hot, tearing pain that stole the air from his lungs. He stumbled backward, the force of the bullet throwing him into Lila. They fell together in a tangled heap behind the long wooden bar. The world was a swirl of splintered vision and roaring sound. He could feel a warm, wet stickiness spreading across his chest. He tried to breathe, but his lungs would not obey. He looked at Lila, her face a pale blur above him, her mouth open in a silent scream. She was dragging him, pulling him deeper behind the cover of the bar. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass filled the air, through the haze of pain. Colt saw her eyes. The terror was gone. In its place was a terrifying, absolute clarity. Her gaze fell on the Colt peacemaker that had slipped from his grasp and now lay on the floor beside him. She reached for it. Her hands were steady. She wrapped both of them around the grip, the way he had shown her in their desert sanctuary during a quiet afternoon. "Brace your feet," he had told her. "Two hands. Do not fight the kick. Become part of it." She rose from behind the bar like a spirit of vengeance. Pike was striding toward them, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Ready to finish the job, he stopped, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her standing there, the heavy pistol leveled at his chest. She fired. The roar of the peacemaker filled the saloon, a sound of thunder and final judgment. Pike staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his fine gray suit. A look of profound, almost comical surprise crossed his features. He looked down at his chest, then back up at Lila, as if he could not comprehend what had just happened. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he fell, crashing into a table with a final, messy ruin of breaking wood and glass. A dead, profound silence fell over the red lantern. Every eye was on Lila, standing behind the bar, the heavy gun still smoking in her hands. Across the room, Vaughn Mercer stared, his face slack with shock, his world crumbling around him. And in that moment of stunned silence, a small, bright flame flared near the saloon's fireplace. Millie Hart stood there, a thin, curled piece of paper held in her hand, its edges turning to black ash. The contract was gone. Lila did not look at it. Her eyes were only on Colt. She dropped the gun and scrambled to his side. "Colt," she whispered, her voice breaking. He was still breathing, his breaths shallow and ragged. She put her arms under his shoulders, her small frame straining with the effort, and pulled him to his feet. He leaned on her, a dead weight, his blood staining the front of her dress. No one moved to stop them. The crowd parted as if by magic. She half dragged, half carried him out of the saloon, out into the cold night air. She somehow managed to get him onto the back of a horse tied to the rail, a horse he had left there earlier, just in case. She climbed up behind him, taking the reins. His limp body slumped against her, and spurred the horse into a desperate gallop, leaving the lights in the chaos and the death of Dust Gulch behind them. The ride was a nightmarish blur, a desperate race against the dawn with death riding close behind. Lila held Colt's unconscious body against her, his blood a warm, sticky presence that soaked through her clothes. The horse, sensing the urgency in her heels, galloped tirelessly through the dark, unforgiving landscape. She had no destination in mind, only a frantic need to put distance between them and Dust Gulch. She was guided by a vague memory of a story she had once heard from a traveling peddler, a story of an old mission, a place of sanctuary, nestled in a valley by a stream that never ran dry. She found it just as the first pale light of morning was spilling over the eastern mountains. Mission Santa Isidora was not a grand edifice, but a small, humble church built of sun-baked adobe, its bell tower a simple, square structure reaching toward the sky. It was surrounded by a low wall, and inside, a grove of ancient cottonwood trees rustled their leaves in the morning breeze. It was a place of profound and abiding peace. A woman in the simple gray habit of a nun was drawing water from a well in the courtyard. She looked up as Lila rode in. Her face, framed by a white wimple, was etched with the fine lines of age and compassion. This was Sister Maria. Lila did not have to speak. The nun saw the blood-soaked man slumped in the saddle, the desperate exhaustion on Lila's face, and understood everything. She moved with a calm, unhurried efficiency, calling for help in a soft but firm voice. 2 young novitiates appeared, and together, they gently lifted Colt from the horse and carried him into a small, clean room in the infirmary wing. For the next week, that small room became Lila's entire world. Sister Maria, who had served as a nurse in a war hospital in her youth, worked with a surgeon's skill and a saint's patience. She cleaned the wound, a deep, ugly puncture that had miraculously missed Colt's heart, but had torn through muscle and lung. With a steady hand, she probed for the bullet, her brow furrowed in concentration. Lila stood by, handing her instruments, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. She watched as the nun stitched the wound closed, the needle a tiny silver fish swimming through the landscape of his flesh. Colt was lost to a world of fever and pain. He tossed and turned, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Lila sat by his bedside day and night, a constant, silent vigil. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth between his cracked lips, and listened to his delirious ramblings. He spoke of his brother, Jacob, his voice filled with a terrible, helpless guilt. He spoke of his wife, Martha, his words a soft litany of love and loss. He was a man flayed open by his past, and Lila, in her quiet watchfulness, bore witness to every scar on his soul. During the long, silent nights, when the only sound was Colt's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a coyote, Lila would slip into the small, candlelit chapel. She had never been a praying woman. The God of her childhood was a distant, judgmental figure who had offered no comfort in her hard life. But now, she found herself kneeling on the cool stone floor, not knowing the right words, not even sure if anyone was listening. She did not pray for a miracle. She did not ask for forgiveness for the life she had taken. She simply spoke into the quiet darkness, her prayers a clumsy, heartfelt litany of hope. She prayed for his breath to steady, for his fever to break, for the guilt to leave his eyes. She was, in her own awkward way, asking the universe to spare the one man who had looked at her and seen not a songbird, but a soul. On the 7th day, the fever broke. Colt woke to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms, her face pale and etched with exhaustion. He watched her for a long time, the early morning light tracing the lines of her face. He remembered flashes of the past week, dreamlike images of her cool hand on his forehead, her soft voice urging him to drink, her constant, unwavering presence. He had been a broken thing, and she had pieced him back together with a fierce, gentle tenacity. His recovery was slow, measured in first steps, then in slow walks around the mission courtyard under the shade of the cottonwoods. He and Lila spoke little, but their silence was no longer a space of unspoken questions. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, the silence of 2 people who had passed through fire together and had come out the other side, changed. As his strength returned, a new, unspoken question began to hang in the air between them. What now? The contract was burned. Pike was dead. They were, for the first time, truly free. But freedom was a vast, terrifying country, and they had no map. One afternoon, sitting by the well, watching the novitiates tend their garden, Lila saw the answer. She saw the simple, honest rhythm of their lives, the planting of seeds, the drawing of water, the mending of cloth. It was a life built not on running away, but on putting down roots. "I do not want to run anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Colt looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "There is a whole world out there, Lila, places you have only sung about." "I have seen enough of the world," she answered. "I want to build a small piece of it, for myself. And so, they stayed. They found a small, abandoned adobe house a mile from the mission, a ruin much like the one that had been their first sanctuary. It had a sound roof, thick walls, and a shallow well that gave sweet water. With the help of Sister Maria and some of the local families, they began the slow, arduous work of making it a home. Colt, his body still mending, found a new purpose. Using the patient techniques he had practiced on the wild mare, he started a small corral. He began to acquire horses that were deemed too difficult, too spirited, and with a quiet hand and a gentle voice, he tamed them. He was not breaking their spirit. He was earning their trust. His reputation as a man who understood the language of horses began to spread, and soon, local ranchers were bringing him their most difficult animals. He was a healer, not just of broken bodies, but of broken spirits. Lila found her own calling. She had a small trunk of books that she had carried with her for years, her only true possessions. She began to teach the children of the local native and immigrant families to read and write. She held her classes in the shade of a large mesquite tree, her voice, which had once filled smoky saloons, now patiently guiding a child's finger as it traced the shape of a letter. She taught the women to sew, her nimble fingers, once used for the guitar, now mending torn clothes and creating new ones. She was building a community, one stitch, one word at a time. Their life was not exciting. It was a simple, quiet rhythm of hard work, small kindnesses, and shared meals. It was a life built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and a deep, unspoken affection. One evening, they were sitting outside their small home, watching the sunset, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of dust and creosote. The small wooden bird Colt had carved for her sat on the windowsill, its wings forever poised between staying and flying. Lila turned to him, a question in her eyes that she had been holding for a long time. "You never asked," she said, her voice soft, "about my past, about the things I had to do to survive before I met you." Colt looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, at the peace that now resided where the fear had once been. He thought of the darkness they had both come from, the ghosts they both carried. "I want your peace more than I want your secrets," he said, his voice a low, gentle rasp. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of such pure, unburdened joy that it took his breath away. It was the smile of a free woman. "Then I will give you both," she said, and reached out, taking his hand in hers. The news from Dust Gulch traveled on the wind, carried by drifters and circuit preachers, a story that grew and twisted with each telling. It began, as most trouble in that country did, with greed. The two men who had survived their encounters with Colt, the one with a shattered arm from the livery stable and the prospector who had fled their garden, found their way back to each other, united by a shared and festering sense of being cheated. They rode back into Dust Gulch not for justice, but for payment, convinced that Vaughn Mercer owed them Pike's reward money. They found Mercer in the Red Lantern, presiding over his diminished kingdom with a sullen, bitter arrogance. The confrontation was short, brutal, and loud. The men demanded Pike's money. Mercer, a man who only paid for services rendered, laughed in their faces. A gun was drawn, a table was overturned, and in the ensuing brawl, fueled by whiskey and rage, the prospector, his mind half crazed by his near-death experience, began to scream the truth. He yelled about the poster, about Pike's money, and about Mercer's business of selling people like cattle. The words, shouted in the sudden silence of a drawn-out fight, hung in the smoky air. They were the spark that lit a long smoldering fire. The town had lived with Mercer's secrets for years, shrouded in a collective, willful ignorance. But hearing the ugly truth spoken so plainly, so brutally, was a shock that could not be ignored. The fight spilled out into the street just as the county sheriff, a slow-moving man with tired but watchful eyes, was riding into town on other business. He found Mercer trying to bludgeon one of the men with a broken chair leg. He found a saloon full of wide-eyed witnesses who could no longer pretend they did not know. And then, something remarkable happened. Millie Hart, who had faded back into the shadows after the night of the fire, stepped forward. Her voice, though trembling, was clear and steady. She spoke of the wooden box, of the contracts, of the fear that Mercer used to rule his small empire. Her courage was a steadying hand offered in the dark. Eli Navarro, the blacksmith, stepped forward next. He spoke of Colt's character, a quiet man who had offered a day's labor for a day's pay. He spoke of Mercer's possessiveness, of the way he treated Lila not as a person, but as an object. And then, a third voice joined theirs. It was a young woman who had worked for Mercer a year before, a girl who had run away in the night after he had presented her with a contract of her own, a document that would have bound her to him for 5 years. The dam of silence had broken. The sheriff, methodical and patient, listened to it all. He looked at Mercer's blustering denials, at the fear and greed warring in his eyes, and he saw the truth. By nightfall, Vaughn Mercer was in handcuffs, his reign of quiet terror over. The town of Dust Gulch was forced to look at its own reflection in the shattered mirror of the red lantern, and it did not like what it saw. The evil of men like Pike and Mercer could only thrive where the apathy of good people gave it soil to grow in, and for the first time, that soil had been salted. Miles away, in their quiet valley. Colt and Lila knew nothing of this. They knew only the rhythms of their own small world, the rising of the sun, the soft nicker of the horses, the taste of fresh water from the well. They heard the news a week later, from a traveling priest who stopped to water his mule and rest in the shade of their home. He told the story as a cautionary tale of greed and divine retribution. To Colt and Lila, it was a distant echo, the sound of a far-off door finally closing. Their freedom had not been granted by a sheriff's decree. It had been forged in a canyon of blood and consecrated in the quiet moments of healing that followed. The town's justice was merely the world catching up to a truth they had already made for themselves. That evening, the sky began to change. The horizon turned a sickly shade of yellow, and the wind, which had been a gentle whisper all day, began to moan. A low, mournful sound that grew in intensity. A dust storm was coming, one of the great rages of the desert that could strip the paint from a wagon and scour the very memory of a trail from the land. The wind tore at their small adobe house, rattling the wooden shutters and forcing fine, gritty dust through every tiny crack. The world outside was a howling, brown chaos, a maelstrom of earth and sky. Inside, it was still and quiet. Colt knelt at the hearth, the scar on his chest a pale, faded line against his skin. He carefully arranged the kindling and logs, his movements slow and deliberate. He struck a match, and the small flame wavered in the drafts before catching, growing into a steady, hungry fire that pushed back the gloom and the chill. The light flickered and danced, casting warm, moving shadows on the smooth mud walls. Lila came to him from behind, her footsteps silent on the packed earth floor. She wrapped her arms around his middle, resting her cheek against the solid warmth of his back. He leaned into her embrace, his hands covering hers. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. The firelight illuminated the room, their sanctuary. It touched the simple wooden table they had built together, the shelf with her few precious books, the mended clothes folded neatly in a corner, and it cast a soft golden glow on the small, carved bird that sat on the mantelpiece. Its wings were half spread, its wooden form forever caught in that moment of decision, a testament to the choice they had both made. Outside, the storm raged, the wind screaming like a lost soul. The desert was a place of chaos and violence, a world that was still untamed and unforgiving. But here, within the 4 walls they had raised with their own hands, they were safe. The storm could not touch them. They had found their peace not by conquering the wilderness, but by building a shelter in its heart. Love, they had learned, was not a prize to be won or a contract to be signed. It was the quiet, steady act of seeing another person's soul, and then building a fire together to keep it warm against the storm. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.